Hello and welcome to Just Roll With It, a board game channel where we review and talk about board games. Today we're going to be talking about the CMON game, Bloodborne the board game, which is obviously an adaptation of the video game. But before we get into the review, let's quickly do a general overview, the high-level overview of the game.
Alright, so real quickly here, I just want to give a very high-level overview of what Bloodborne the board game is. So it's going to be a cooperative sort of dungeon crawl style game for 1 to 4 players, and it's going to play in roughly 60 to 90 minutes. I'd say you're probably looking at hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that, at least from our experience, and that is just for a single chapter of a 3-chapter scenario that you'll be completing in that time. So again, very high level overview. This isn't meant to be like a rules thing. This is just so you can get, if you're not familiar with the game like I was when I initially heard about it, just a general idea of how it plays and what's unique about it. So when you start out, the chapter is going to give you all the sort of setup information that you're going to need. So that's going to be like the enemies and tiles and things you're playing with, but you'll get that when you get there. So a basic round of Bloodborne the board game is going to consist of each of the players, who are each controlling a hunter, taking their turn in any order they choose. So, one turn, the Saw Cleaver hunter can go first that we have here. Another turn, a different character can go first. Everybody gets 1 activation, and then the round is over. So we can see here, start of the round, all hunters reveal their hands up to 3. So you get to draw 3 cards from your 12-card deck. This is always going to be 12 cards, even as you upgrade. All of the starting cards are the same. So we'll have 3 draw 1s of the basic, 3 plus 1 attack or damage, 3 dodge cards, and yeah, that should be it. And the 3 staggers. So everyone will have the exact same starting deck. They'll also have picked out their hunter that they're going to choose, so that's basically just choosing the weapon, and they will also have a starting hunter pistol. They're all super basic, but you'll have that. So when you take your turn, you're going to essentially be able to do multiple different actions, and we got a handy player aid here. So the things you could do are attack, move to, interact with a piece on the board. So here we have a consumable spot, so that's what you'd be interacting with. Transform your weapon, or go to the Hunter's Dream, and the Hunter's Dream is where you're going to be upgrading cards. So on your turn, you're going to draw your 3 cards, and every action you do is going to basically take 1 card. So if I want to move, and I can move 2 spaces, I discard 1 of my cards, I choose which one I want to discard, and then I can move 2 spaces. So this is a space, anything separated by a white line, and then the whole thing is referred to as a tile. So when I move off the tile, we'll draw a new tile, and we'll place it on there, and we can choose any orientation we want for that. So that was my first action card. I got 2 left. Then let's say I want to fight this monster that I'm now on the tile with. So let me, perfect. We got our hunter's mob. So all the monsters you're going to be facing are up here on the game board. We're going to be fighting the hunter's mob. And one moment while I grab the basic actions, which I forgot to take out. So the enemies are all going to use the same 6-card deck. They all share the same deck. This is going to consist of 3 basic, 2 special, and 1 ability card. So you can kind of predict with that information, which cards have been flipped, what cards are going to get flipped next. So if we attack this guy, so we used 1 action already, which cost us a card. But we can use another card, but instead of discarding this one, for the attack action, we actually put it onto our hunter board, into one of the slots on our trick weapon. So in this case, we basically just want to be faster than our enemy. So our enemy here, he has 4 health, and then this is his basic attack, special attack, and ability, which corresponds to those enemy action cards that I showed earlier. So you can see that most of his cards are only speed 2, so they're medium speed, which means if we do a speed 3 attack, we can be faster than him. So let's go ahead and just do a quick cut. We'll notice also that the special ability of this weapon, if you can see that, is that it attacks, any attacks with stagger also deal +1 damage, so that's a pretty good ability. And then on the bottom of here, we have this handy, this basically shows what's on the reverse side of the weapon. So when you clear the weapon, so once all the slots are filled and you can no longer use it, you're going to flip it over to clear those slots. And so we can basically see ahead of time what the ability is for that particular, for the other side, and then what speeds and how much damage they do. So, but if we were to do this here, so we play our basic strength card, which gives us +1 damage on a quick attack that already does 1 damage. So we're going to hit him first. We're going to hit him for 2 damage, and then we're going to reveal his card. So it looks like he's doing a special ability, which is his Shield Bash here, in the middle of the card, which is speed 2. So we hit him first because we have 3 speeds, so we're faster. That does 2 damage to us, unfortunately, and every hunter starts with 6 health. And then he's going to stagger and stun us. So if we look at our handy-dandy card here, so stagger cancels enemy attacks with slower speed. Well, ours is faster, so we hit him first. He doesn't get to cancel our attack. And then he also stuns us. Hunter must discard 1 card from their hand. If they can't, they suffer a damage. So we did still have 1 card, so we'll go ahead and discard that. But we did 2 damage to him, so we can go ahead and put that on the board. So that's just a very high-level overview of how it works. When you kill these guys, you're going to get what are called blood echoes. You can have a maximum of 3 of these. And when you either die and go, when you take the action, one of the actions that we talked about before, to go to the Hunter's Dream, you can then spend those on these different upgrades. So there's all sorts of great stuff in the deck, all sorts of wonderful upgrades that you can get. I haven't found any that are just truly terrible. They all seem very, very good, and you can kind of tailor your deck to that experience. Once everybody's activated, or once your hunter is activated, rather, at the end of your turn, your enemies are going to activate. So if they're in the same space or in a tile or space adjacent to you, so if I was here, this tile is adjacent, they're going to move 1 towards you. If I was here, they'd move 1 into my space because they're still adjacent to me, and then they would attack me. So that's basically just resolving their attack. Now, let's pretend I had a dodge card. That would be a good time to use that. So dodge is basically used in response to an attack. So after the enemy has flipped and we see what card, what ability they're doing, we can then play down a dodge into one of our slots. And that allows us to basically, as long as we're faster, the slot is faster than whatever the enemy's attack is, we can basically avoid the damage. Obviously I didn't have this in my hand, but just as an example, that's how dodge would work, is you get to see what the enemy's doing, and then you can play that in response to it. And then this one also has the added effect of clearing the slot, which is very convenient so that we don't take up too many slots. Your pistol can basically be used as when an enemy makes a basic action, basic attack, you can automatically stagger that enemy, which is obviously pretty good. But once you've gone and the enemy has gone, all the other hunters go, all the other players go, and that's the end of the round. And basically all you do is just move the time track forward. If it lands on one of these red spaces, all the monsters are going to get respawned and healed. All the consumables are going to come back, so you can go and get those. And yeah, your goal is just to push the scenario to conclusion before you run out of time on that track. And the main way you're going to do that is you're going to have 2 types of missions that the scenario is going to give you. So the first is a hunt mission. These are essentially like the main mission that you're trying to push forward. And usually these will say things like, for instance, this one is complete the hunt by slaying this Scourge Beast. So there's a specific Scourge Beast that this card will spawn, which is one of the enemies in the game. Once you beat that, you get to reveal a different card. And so that's how all of the progression works in this game, is you're just going to be revealing different cards. And again, the way that you're going to complete the scenario, or the chapter rather, one of the 3 chapters in the scenario, is you're going to be completing these hunt missions. Insight missions will often be, you'll need a certain amount of insight, which you'll get from completing insight missions in order to progress the hunt mission. But insight missions themselves are optional. Those are not required. And that's pretty much it. You win when you get a card, when you complete the hunt mission, and it tells you you've completed the the chapter, and then you can go ahead and just set up and move to the next chapter. But yeah, hopefully that's a very high-level overview of the game, and kind of explains how the card combat works, and that you're essentially trying to be faster than your opponent and deal enough damage to kill them so that they die before they hit you. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So we'll get back to the review.
So with that overview in mind, let's talk about the game. So Sam, what are your initial thoughts on the game? Like just general, just overall thoughts.
Generally I'd say it's an above average game at the very least. It has a lot of unique mechanics that pull it out from just the average board game, such as the combat system that you just saw, and some of the card mechanics and building your deck and upgrading it, and it makes it just a little bit different than the average game.
Yeah, I agree. It is very much a dungeon crawl game. There's no getting around that. But it does try to, I think, pretty well adapt sort of the unique mechanics of Bloodborne versus other Souls games. That being the trick weapons, which I will have covered in the overview section a little bit more detail. But I think it's a cool system that actually accurately reflects how the weapons in the game work, where they have two different modes, and you can switch between them, and they behave differently. I think what makes the game special is definitely the combat. It's not just rolling dice. A lot of dungeon crawlers are just roll a lot of dice and hope you get good thing from rolling dice and not blank thing. Which is one of the things I did not like about the Dark Souls board game, rather, which we'll maybe talk about in a future video. But the card combat is really well done. I also really like the speed system. Again, there will be more detail in the overview section, but enemies attack at different speeds and different amounts of damage, and you basically, your goal, if you're good at the game, is to attack before them, and thus, kill them or prevent them from doing damage before they do you damage. So anytime you attack an enemy, it's going to attack you back, which I like. So your goal is basically to strategize around that, and it's pretty deterministic. But there's enough randomness to make it interesting. Attack before them and hopefully kill them, so you don't get damaged yourself, which is, I think, it's something unique, it's something different. A lot of games just have, like I said, dungeon crawls, roll dice, and then you'll have some sort of defense that'll cut the amount of damage the enemy does. And this doesn't have that. You basically not simultaneously, but more or less simultaneously are attacking each other, and you're just trying to be faster and more efficient at killing them. You know how much damage they're going to deal, you know how fast they're likely going to be, because of the enemy action deck, which is nice and simple. It's only 6 cards, and enemies only have the 3 attacks. They have their basic, their special, and their ability. There's 3 basic in here, 2 special, and 1 ability. So based on the cards that have already been drawn, you can kind of predict pretty, within, pretty close what they're going to do next, and I like that, because the game, the game is not, the video game is not completely random, right? You kind of know what an enemy's about to do, so there's some of that as well.
And I think another thing is that the campaign aspect also renders itself well to a game such as this, and that's once again another problem with the Dark Souls, which maybe we will come back to later. But
we'll keep comparing at that just because they're both Soulsborne adaptations of video games. So,
but I think that the primary focus being the campaign aspect is the more important part, rather than making it a good game that you just play one-off. Making it a campaign game that you can play one-off, which we'll eventually do, and that makes it also better for that style of game, since of course the video game.
I should say we've, as of this review, we've only played the Long Hunt campaign. So the base game comes with 4 different scenarios each is 3 chapters. There's 4 of them, each 3 chapters. That you can play. You can play them in any order, so there's no overarching story or anything. But I actually think it really works well. So you basically just grab a deck of cards, which is your campaign. It's 3 missions long, so it's not terribly long. I think it was 5 or 6 hours. We played through the whole thing in one sitting. It was a pretty good amount of time. When I hear campaign game, I own a lot of them, and I have yet to get through them. Like Gloomhaven, yes, there's a lot of content, but there's like 200 scenarios. Not quite, but there's a lot, and that's like hundreds of hours to get through one campaign, which is fine. But I like that this game has the campaign because I think, like you said, it lends itself very well to that sort of like loose story, because that's kind of how the games are, right? You're going and you're killing bosses, but you need that like lead up to the boss, right? You can't just skip right to the boss, because that's, you know, that's just not what the game is. There's a lot of like moving around, upgrading your character. You need to have that sense of progression. And that's why, like, the 3 chapters, you can save between chapters. The chapters aren't terribly long, 1 to 2 hours, something like that. I think the box says 60 to 90 minutes. I think that's pretty accurate, especially if you've played the game before. And I like this system. Basically, you're going to draw cards out. You'll have hunt missions and you'll have insight missions. Insight missions are sort of optional, but usually the hunt missions, which is like the main way you're going to progress, are going to be requiring certain insight missions to be completed and things. But it's a very simple system. You have numbered cards. The cards will tell you when you complete them, hey, draw card number 10. And then you read number 10, and that's the next thing you have to do. So it's a pretty elegant way of doing it. It gets a little... There can be a lot of cards out, but I think overall it's pretty simple, because for the most part, the cards are really straightforward. It's like, go kill X number of Scourge Beasts, a certain enemy, or go and rescue this person and bring them here. The missions are very simple, and it's pretty clear when you've completed them. There's not really a lot of question, and it's nice not to have to like flip through a book. And so that's where I say it has a good amount of campaign, where some people hear campaign and they get scared away because they think something like Gloomhaven, where like, am I ever going to play this? Am I ever going to finish it? Or am I going to play it 4 times and never come back to it? No, you can easily complete this in one sitting or break it up into 3. It saves really easily. And that's fun. I think it works well, better than the Dark Souls board game in terms of like having that sense of progression. What was I gonna say? I'm gonna talk about something I didn't like. What was I gonna say? The other thing I really liked is how quick the setup is. So the setup cards have like all the enemies you're going to use, and all the tiles you're going to use. You just get the map tiles all out. It'll tell you like shuffle in some random ones, and you just put those out, and you're pretty much ready. Like there's not a ton of setup time. Some of these campaign games or some of these like miniature games can have like a ton of cards and tokens and stuff that you have to take out. There's really not a ton of tokens. That was another thing I liked, is that they didn't go like overboard with status effects and crazy stuff like that. It's pretty simple. Every hunter starts out with the same 12 cards in their deck. You have the upgrade card deck, so when you kill enemies, you're going to get Blood Echoes, and Blood Echoes are basically your XP that you can use to get new cards. These cards replace the cards in your deck, so you'll always have 12. And other than that, like there's a couple status effect tokens, you get your health tokens, and there's like, insight and corpse tokens and like NPC tokens that you put on the board, but there's not like a billion tokens. It actually feels like there's an appropriate amount of components for what they're trying to do. Sometimes you get those, especially like Kickstarter games and things, where they try way too hard to like do everything that the video game does, or have like, just look at all these components that we have. There's actually a pretty like appropriate amount of components. There's not like 50 different decks of cards. There's basically 3. You got your consumables, you got your upgraded hunter cards, and then like your items that you could acquire. Nice, I'd say generally pretty streamlined. Like there's not a lot of that. There's not a lot of upkeep either between turns, which I like. It's basically just draw 3 cards and you're ready to go. That's the next round, Mm-hmm. Things that didn't like. I did remember what I was going to say. The rulebook is not great. It's not the worst rulebook ever, and it's pretty short, but I think it fails to I think it's sort of the way that it's presented, and some of the examples could be a little bit better. When we played, the thing that we struggled with the most was understanding there was 2 main things. When we completed insight missions, which in hindsight, it's actually pretty easy because you get a special card that looks very different, and you just kind of put that on top. Because as you like go through these, you just kind of stack them together, because once you complete the thing, you just kind of keep stacking them. and then you'll get one that's like full, this like beige color. The whole thing will be, and that's your completed mission, and then you can kind of stack those together and set them aside, and then that counts as an insight, which is what we were confused about, is that a lot of the hunt missions, which are how you're going to progress the story and move forward, are going to require like X number of insight. The players to have X number of insight, and when you complete an insight mission, that's considered an insight, which we thought we were going to get tokens or something. That was kind of maybe that's on me reading the rule book, but and then the other thing is that the way enemy movement works is if you move out of a space or tile that an enemy is on during your move action, so during your turn, the enemy will basically move one space towards you. But then also, once your turn is completely done, any enemy that is on your tile or on any adjacent tile is going to move one towards you as well. It works. It's fine. It's a little weirdly conveyed in the rulebook, and it took us a little bit to kind of like get used to that. It is different. It works. I think it makes sense thematically. It's not a bad thing, but it took us a little bit to get used to that and like make sure we were doing it right. But overall, I mean, I think you could watch a video on this game. It's not a particularly difficult teach, I don't think. It's pretty simple. I think the other complicated thing is like the dodge mechanic and how that works. But once you figure it out, it's not too bad. Is there anything else you didn't care for?
I think overall, the one thing, if I were to say anything other than that, would be the map tiles work well, but sometimes the map tiles can be a little bit weird with having the random map tiles every now and then. And we had an experience at, I believe, the last mission we did on our game, that we had basically a bridge that you couldn't pass enemies, and we had to bring a boss across that bridge. But if you can't pass the enemies, then you can't really move the boss. So we kind of just went around that just for that scenario because we kind of got stuck there otherwise.
Yeah, and it's one of those things like, yeah, because the way it was set up is basically at the beginning of the scenario, you specifically put a tile farther away, like it was part of the setup. But the tile that was between the tile it was saying, and the starting tile was just a random tile, and we just got really unlucky in that we took, I think it's the Great Bridge. There's a tile that has a special rule, so some of the tiles will have like these special rules in the corner that are unique to that tile, which is a good way of doing it without making it overly like rules heavy, because it only matters when you're on the tile, so you just print it on the tile. But specifically said, you can't move when you're on a space with an enemy, which is kind of an issue when you're fighting the clock, because obviously, you know, you're working against time here, which is also, I think, generally a good mechanic. It keeps you moving, you're not just sitting around, and you also know that the game will end. Because some games can kind of have that, like, when is it going to end? When are we going to hit the end? Because it's a campaign, you don't exactly have, like, this is your objective. Yeah, that was a bit of a weird situation, but since it's co-op, you can kind of fudge the rules. I think anybody who plays co-op does that. But yeah, that was a good thing, because, yeah, that was just sort of a weird situation. And we just worked around it.
And I still definitely enjoy the way that the map tiles work, just, the one situation.
Yeah, and like I said, it was just this is the stack of tiles, and we just happened to randomly put that one in. The other thing I would say is, I've heard this from other people as well, there is a rule that if you fail a scenario, meaning you either run out of time, basically run out of time, you're supposed to start the whole campaign over again. I don't think anyone plays that rule. If we had failed the third chapter, I don't think we were going to start the whole thing over again. What people just say, house rule, is just start from the beginning of that chapter, and try to put, like, basically the only thing that you really have to worry about resetting would be, like, cards you upgraded during that chapter, which you can just, like, put a few back or something, of the ones that you've put into your deck. I wouldn't restart the whole thing. I think that's a bit much. But yeah, overall, much better than I expected. I kind of just wrote it off because I thought it was just going to be the Dark Souls board game, which I have thoughts on. But I like that it has a unique combat system that makes sense. Component-wise, pretty good. I wish, like, this stuff was cardboard, like the player boards especially, are just, it's pretty good cardstock material. It's like, but I don't know. For like $100 game, like the base game, I could do some cardboard. But there actually is quite a bit of content in the base game. There's obviously, it's a CMON game. There's like 1 billion expansions for it. But having the 4, 3-chapter scenarios in the base game is pretty good. That's a pretty decent amount of content. I mean, it took us a whole sitting to get through one. If we want to talk about expansions briefly, half of them are impossible to get unless you want to pay $200 for them because they were exclusive to the Kickstarter. The other half, which is basically what I have, so the Chalice Dungeon is cool because the one other negative I would say is you don't see a ton of different enemies. I'm sure it changes based on the scenarios that you played, but the scenario we played, we basically had these same 3 enemies the whole 3 chapters. Which is fine. The one nice thing is all of the enemies are double-sided, which means when you start a scenario, you shuffle them up and you randomize the side that they're on. So it gives a bit of variety. So that way, even though we're fighting the same 3 enemies for 3 scenarios in a row, they'll have different sides which have different abilities on them. And then you also randomly place them out on these symbols, which are the symbols that determine when we draw a tile which ones spawn. So you also won't be just seeing the same distributions of them. Like sometimes we'll see, different ones in different areas or different amounts of different ones, which is good. But that's the Chalice Dungeon expansion. So in the game, you can do these things that are basically like procedurally generated dungeons. The Chalice Dungeon expansion quite literally does that, where you can mix any random enemies that you have, so it allows you to play with more variety. And the dungeon is also, it's a one-shot story kind of thing. It's not a whole campaign, which I kind of like. So it's just like the free play mode. You can randomize a whole bunch of stuff, go in, do a short dungeon as opposed to a whole campaign. It's structured basically the same way as this, but it's a lot shorter. And fight a boss. And so I like that there's that option. I think that's a good expansion. Haven't played with it yet, but even just, the rules are very simple. It's just basically a shorter, more diverse in terms of like enemy and location and stuff than this. And so you can fight any boss, you can fight any monsters. So that looks good. I think that's a good one to have just for like the shorter experience. The stretch goal stuff is cool, but the weird thing is, like any of the monsters it adds, there aren't cards for in the base game, the stretch goal stuff. So it's not really a must-have. It adds 3D miniatures for the consumables, which are like little chests. There's some over there. And then also 3Ds for the lamps that you go to. No means essential. But yeah, the weird thing is like the enemies that come in it, you basically would have to play the Chalice Dungeon to use them, unless you just chose to fight those instead of whatever the scenario says. Which would be my other complaint about the game, is that, yeah, you don't see a lot of diversity in enemies. It keeps the components down, obviously, but basically if you want to play with different enemies, you're going to have to play whatever expansion those came in. They're never going to get mixed into anything else. Which, to be fair, is kind of thematic. The different areas in Bloodborne have different enemies, and so that's kind of reflected. Then there's the Hunter's Dream expansion, which adds basically enemy hunters that are mini bosses that you can choose to fight as a part of any campaign. So you can basically add those into a campaign where you fight a mini boss. I think it adds some other little things too, but the mini bosses are the big thing. And then pretty much all the other ones are basically just, here's the characters and environments of a specific region in the game, a couple bosses usually a couple new scenarios, and no extra rules or anything. I think I would say that's a pro, for me at least, that there's really not a ton of extra rules or anything. They all pretty much just operate the same way. You read the card, that tells you how to set up the scenario, what enemies you're going to fight, what tiles you need, and you start, and you go. So, yeah. Any other final thoughts, Sam, before we review it, rank it, and do the 3 C's?
I guess as an overview, I'd say the game is a great adaptation while not being an exact copy of the game.
Yeah.
You have the mechanics of the game, like the switching weapons and things, but it doesn't feel like you're just oh, I'm playing the video game, but a board game. It feels different, so that there is a reason to play the board game rather than the video game, or vice versa. So it lends itself well as a board game adaptation.
Yeah, I think that's... I was going to mention that, and I totally forgot. Yeah, it's a really good adaptation without just being a carbon copy. Because obviously, like, you know, when you have a video game, the computer can handle all sorts of things that you don't have to worry about. Whereas with a board game, you're doing all the upkeep and micromanaging things. And there's really not a lot of that. And I actually really like how they did that. Where it doesn't feel like there's... Like I said, when you're done with a round, basically you choose the order the hunters go in. Once everybody's gone, once everybody's gone, you basically just, everybody draws back up to 3 cards and you go again. And you keep going until you run out of time, you know. And it works really well. Very thematic, you know, where you go and upgrade, Hunter's Dream. That's how you upgrade in the game. That's how you get new level ups. I think it's kind of neat the way that they did the skills. There's not like a skill tree or anything like the Dark Souls board game. You can like upgrade, you know, strength and stamina and things like you can in the video game. The way they do it in this is there's just basically they boiled everything down to 3 categories. So if you want something that's good for that, so like your healing cards are going to be like your dodge and your healing cards are going to be your green ones. Your general just like, I guess also kind of healing and like removing status effects and drawing extra cards. I mean, that's a big thing is going to be your vitality, your health. You've got your sort of like skill. So these are going to be skill-based weapons, that sort of thing. It kind of, you know, in the game, that's a big thing. And then you have just your strength. So extra damage, you know, different things like that. So it's interesting how they boiled it down. I also really like that basically every card feels really good. They're all basically direct upgrades. And you're basically never going to not replace one of your starting cards. Not that the starting cards are terrible, but like as you're starting to get the upgrades... They all feel really good, and you can definitely tailor it to your playstyle, because the different weapons also feel pretty different, which is another cool thing I guess we didn't really touch on, but there's tons of different weapons that you can get, and they all definitely have different playstyles, which is cool. Like, when we played, Bradley's weapon was very much low damage, so all of his stuff was really fast, but did almost no damage. But then his weapon's ability was for every filled slot on his weapon, he did extra damage. So he always wanted to basically have all of his slots filled. So he's doing a lot of little attacks, but then once he had them all filled, he could do big attacks very quickly. Mine, I played with the Kirk Hammer, which is my favorite weapon from the video game. It has a lot of like quick attacks on one side, and then really heavy and slow attacks, like huge damage on the other when you're using it in its hammer form. And I think that was handled really well. Again, without being too much upkeep, or it's a very smooth system, but you still get the general vibe of the game. Still very much feels like Bloodborne. Yeah, definitely. Should we do the 3 C's? So... we came up with our sort of review gimmick. So this isn't exactly a review score, right? So we'll do a review score of like 1 to 10 or whatever, what we personally felt the game was. The 3 C's is supposed to be more of a recommendation on buying. So we have comprehension, complexity, and consideration. Those are the 3 C's. Comprehension is going to be how long it takes you to comprehend the game. Is it a lot to wrap your head around? Is the rule, that kind of goes back to like poor rule books, things like that, where your game can have high comprehension without a bad rule book, but that obviously doesn't help you comprehend a game if you need to watch videos and things to understand how it plays. Complexity, pretty simple. How complex is the game? Outside of comprehension, how long does it take you to grasp the complexity and play the game? Is it an easy game to kind of remember, or do you have to read the rules every single time? Like, I guess an example of that would be like, for me, Mage Knight. Every time I want to play that game, I have to reread the rules. I would say that's high complexity. There's a lot going on there. Basically any Vladish Fatil game. And then consideration is the last one, right? I think I said it right. Consideration, which is going to be on your turn generally. how much consideration you have to do. I guess that could be, a lot of people say like analysis paralysis. You know, some people get overwhelmed by too many options, and so consideration would be sort of a metric of that. So this will be sort of like a joint, like we can kind of discuss and come to I think a 1 through 5 for each of them. So let's start with, let's do comprehension. Would you say on a 1 to 5?
I was kind of thinking probably a 2 or a 3.
Yeah, I would say it's about middle. I think once you get it, it's really not that complicated, especially if you played other dungeon crawls. I noted, obviously, earlier, some of the like rule stuff was a little like, it's not bad, and it makes sense once you do it, how the enemies move, and that, you know, they're basically going to follow you, because the thing in the video game, after you've cleared an area, is you can just kind of run past enemies. And so they kind of try to fit that into the game, and it makes sense, and it also gives you kind of that like claustrophobia too, of the enemies are like encroaching on you, which you want. But that takes a little bit, I think, just the way it's written and stuff for that. So I'd say, yeah, 2 or 3. Not a particularly complex game, or high comprehension. It's generally pretty good. So yeah, I'd say let's go 3. Let's go 3. So that was consideration, right? Or no, comprehension. Mm-hmm. So let's do consideration now. On your turn, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much consideration would you say that there is? Like, I'm trying to think of a good example. I could use Mage Knight again, kind of. Because that one, there's a lot of things you can do. I mean, you have a map, and you have all these different places you can go, and then you have all these cards that you're basically playing down to do those things. So that's pretty high consideration, I think. Or like, I don't know, something like Rebellion, or like War of the Ring, where you're trying to determine what your strategy is for the round and stuff. I'd say this is pretty low on the consideration. I think at first when I read that your hand was always 3 cards, I was kind of like, that doesn't seem like you can do a lot in your turn. But you'd be surprised, especially with the starting purple cards, the like vitality cards, and especially most of the ones that you can upgrade with will let you draw more cards. So when you do an action, you draw another card. So you're basically like getting free actions then. But even outside of that, even just with the 3, you can do quite a bit of stuff. You know, you can move, which you can move 2 whenever you move, and then you can attack, and you can, you can do quite a few things with just 3 cards. I was kind of surprised.
I mean, if you used all 3 of your cards to attack, that would fill up your entire weapon, and then you'd have to flip it to clear it. So honestly,
which costs you
basically,
a card. So,
yeah, it's a full turn to attack with your
But
weapon.
like I said, I was skeptical of how low the amount of cards was, because I kind of thought there wouldn't be enough consideration. But I think there was like an appropriate amount. I would say it was pretty low, which low would be good, I guess. Less consideration. I would say like 2. There's enough there for it to be strategic. There definitely is a strategy, especially where you play them on your board, and which cards you play, because you're gonna obviously want to keep your really good attack ones. And there are a lot of situations where you'll draw a hand, and your deck is really small too. You only have 12 cards, which means every time you draw, you have a quarter of your deck in your hand, which I think is good, because then the deck is not super random. But yeah, there's enough consideration there of like where you're going to play it on the weapon, and like I said, there will be situations where you'll draw your cards, and you'll have all really good combat cards, and you're going to have to lose one of those, and you kind of have to like try to decide like which one do I want to lose to move, to get in range of the boss or whatever. But I don't think there's too much. I think it's like a 2, I would say.
I would agree, yeah.
I mean, would
2.
you want to lobby for like a 3? I think a 2.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty low, but with still a good amount of strategy. So we did comprehension, we did consideration, so we have complexity. Like a 2.5.
Yeah.
3?
I would honestly say if I which it was pretty recently that we played it, but still, honestly, if we came back to it, I could easily play it right now.
I think, and that's one thing that makes these really hard, is obviously this is supposed to be a metric of understanding or helping others in an unbiased way as much as possible, right? It's not part of the review. It's part of just like, here's the game, here's the mechanics, and here's how it we think other people, but we play a lot of games, so that's going to skew a little bit, right? It's probably going to skew. We're gonna say things are less complex. We're going to say things are less consideration because we've played a lot of video games. So we try to be fair with that. I still think it's probably a 2 or 3. I think I could easily walk away from this from a couple of months. I think that's also a good metric. And come back to it, remember the rules, and be able to play it, which is good. Because like I said, I like Mage Knight. 2 weeks after I read the rules, I couldn't tell you how to play it. Or all like the little nuances and things. Same thing with like Through the Ages. I feel bad I'm picking on Vlada. But his games definitely are, I would say, notorious for being very heavy, very complex. There's a lot of like little minutia rules and things that are harder to remember, where this really doesn't have that. It's very much take the card, you set it up, you do the map tiles, you run around and you do the things. So, I don't know, would you say 2 or 3? Kind of somewhere between both of those.
I would say probably,
Let's say you've never played a game before. I think it's closer to a 3. Probably.
I'd say probably
2.5, 3. Let's just go with 3 so I can just write 3 on there. Just because, like I said, we've played a lot of games. We've played a lot of other dungeon crawlers, and I think that helps because it has a similar rule set. So, cool. Well, I guess that brings us to just final verdict. So this is personal opinions. The 3 C's are not personal opinions. We try to be unbiased with those and just for should you buy it kind of thing. Actually, let's first do would you recommend someone buy this, and then your personal rating.
I think I would probably recommend someone buy this because it is a different game. The combat is different, as I said kind of towards the beginning. The combat's different, and like I like exactly how they did the timing with everything. Like running against the clock while also having to get upgrades to make yourself better for the final encounter at the end of each mission. And I think it works pretty well as what it's intended to do. So I think if I were asked, I'd recommend it, yeah.
I think, so as far as I go, I think I would recommend it, definitely. Like I said, I initially just sort of wrote this one off because I saw it as sort of like, to me it looked like just, without doing really obviously any research on it, I just thought, oh, it's the same people as the Dark Souls game, Steamforged. Wasn't a huge fan of that. Again, talk about that at a different time. I think there's a good game somewhere in there, but the game as it is not particularly wonderful. So looking deeper into this, I like the way it plays. I definitely think, as far as recommendation goes, there are some caveats. You probably want to like the game or like Souls games. I don't necessarily know that you would care about the theme. I mean, I guess if you just like Cthulhu and things, you may still dig the theme because it's basically that, running around and hunting monsters. I guess it's not a particularly like complex theme, but all the items and stuff are all themed around things in the game, and it's going to make more sense if you've played the game. But I do think there's a decent amount of replayability just in the base game with the 4 different scenarios that each have 3 chapters, and then even within the missions that you draw and things and the choices you make will change it a little bit. I wouldn't say it's vastly different, but you could play the first one again, I think, and we could make different choices and do different objectives and get different results. Like the third scenario in the Long Hunt actually asks you basically which insight missions you completed in previous chapters, and then based on that, things will be easier or different. So there is definitely some replayability. It's not going to be completely different. It's going to be the same general structure, but I think that helps too. As far as expansions go, though, I would say if you're going to get it, the base game is definitely sufficient. The Chalice Dungeon is probably the other one I would recommend just because it lets you basically play the shorter campaign with whatever enemies you want. So as far as mixing stuff in and doing whatever you want, that's a good one. The stretch goal stuff is cool if you go that route. Especially, I mostly bought it for the additional hunters that you can play as. And there's some really cool hunters in there. The rest of it, though, is pretty, like I said, the enemies, you have to have, like, the Chalice Dungeon to actually use them, which is a weird choice. Like, I would have done, like, enemy types. Like, they have, like, a keyword, and then you could mix in, like a scenario could have Scourge Beast. Like, it could use the name, or it could use the type. Say, like, mix in 2, like, werewolf-type enemies. You know what I mean? Something like that, so that you could use the enemies a little bit more. Because pretty restricted as far as the campaign goes. But yeah, overall, definitely recommend, especially if you're a fan of the Soulsborne games. This, I think, is the best adaptation of them. I haven't played any of the card games, but I've played the Dark Souls board game, and this is a better game. Cool. So then, final verdict. What is your personal 1 to 10? We're very original with the rating system, 1 to 10. What do you give it? So 6. So I guess we should explain, because sometimes people see 1 to 10 differently. 1 being, I never want to see it or hear from it again. 5 being it was completely average, like wasn't offensively bad, but it also was not like I could never play it again and I'd be fine. And 10 obviously being like perfect game, no complaints, absolutely wonderful. I'd play it every single day of my life and never get tired of it.
I think I of course don't think it's definitely an average game. I wouldn't give it, of course, the top rating. I don't think it's the greatest game that has existed on the earth. So I would probably give it 7 or an 8. Maybe playing more of it, I might like give it more of an 8 or more of a 7. But I think kind of in between there for.
Yeah, I was going to say 7. It's definitely above average. It's definitely, I would say, like one of my favorite dungeon crawls I've played, especially because, like I said, it has the campaign, but it's only 3 chapters, and you could feasibly play it in one long sitting. So yeah, I'd give it a 7. Like Sam said, I think it could potentially go up as I play some of the different campaigns, which is why I added that we've only technically played the first one, which I still think is a decent amount. I mean, we played like 6 hours of it. We get the general, the gameplay and stuff. But it would be interesting to fight against some of the different enemies, because like I said, we only got to fight against 3, and there's like 10 in the base game. You know, so there's obviously, you know, much different enemies and things that you get to fight. Yeah, I'd say a 7. That could potentially become an 8. Or stay a 7. But, yeah. Awesome. Well, anything else, or are you good? I think that covers it. Well, thank you for watching our review of Bloodborne the board game. Until next time.